Hello and welcome to this video lecture for Philosophy of Psychology Week 4. And this week we're going to have a look at psychology and humanism. And humanism was a movement that developed in psychology in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the post-war period. So we're going to talk about it, and this will help us sort of get a sense of how psychology is related to its social and historical context, and really sort of reflects that context. And we'll see that dynamic at work in humanism, which reflects the idea of an affluent society as it developed in the post-war period. So we're still thinking about psychology and society here. We're thinking of it here in relation to how psychology develops in its social context. And we'll see humanism is a kind of interesting example of this. And Erich Fromm develops his own sort of unique account of social and mental health, and how the structure of society and mental health are related, sort of developing humanist themes in his own unique way. So that's what we're going to explore. That's what we're going to explore this week. So humanism was originally known as third force psychology, and it was referred to in this way because it rejected the two dominant forms of psychology present at that time in the 1950s. The two sort of dominant psychologies here were Freud's psychoanalysis, which again looked at sort of very sort of disturbed individuals who sort of couldn't function in some way, and sort of went through this sort of process of analysis, trying to get at the sort of unconscious mechanisms driving their choices. And the other sort of psychology at the time that was very dominant at the time was behaviorism. And behaviorism was associated with B.F. Skinner, who's pictured here at the bottom picture more than anybody else, really. He was a sort of he was known as a behaviorist psychologist, and the sort of the real idea of behaviorism, the sort of the focus on outward behavior and conditioning. A lot of the sort of insights emerged from sort of experiments and studies on animals, and then were sort of carried over to the human realm. So there's a lot of sort of overlap there, and a sort of sense that, you know, human behavior is in many ways similar to other species. Humans are sort of, you know, they're sort of attracted and repelled by things, and that's sort of the way to understand their conduct. And a lot of humanists, of course, found this a very sort of sparse view of human beings and what they're capable of, and really sort of the humanists really rebelled against these sort of limited takes of human life and human capacity, and they sort of produced alternatives in the 50s and 60s. So third force psychology was opposed to both Freudian psychoanalysis and behaviorism, and it was inspired by a number of movements in other areas, in philosophy, in poetry, in literature, rather than in the history of psychology. So romanticism emerged in the 18th century in Germany and was a kind of rebellion against mechanistic industrial civilization, and its sort of focus on material production and its sort of neglect of broader aesthetic values. And the basic idea of sort of romanticism promoted the idea that humans are not just rational, but they're also naturally good and social. And it distrusted authorities of science, religious dogma, reason, and societal laws, and saw a kind of innate, kind of natural goodness in human beings that should be cultivated. Phenomenology was a philosophy that emerged in the beginning of the 20th century. It was really focused on the makeup of subjective experience. So what does it feel like to experience? And how do we sort of go from our experience of something to our sort of awareness of an objective external world? given that all we have is our own sort of subjective experience. So phenomenology sort of analyzes how we sort of get the sort of broader structures of reality from within our own sort of subjective experience, our own mental experience. Existentialism stresses very strongly the ideas of choice and authenticity. Living authentically is seen as living in a way that's sort of freely chosen by the person themselves, so not imposed by society or other authorities. And for Heidegger, who was one of the existentialists, it requires awareness of death. That one of the ways we live inauthentically is by sort of denying that sort of reality about the sort of temporal conditionedness of our reality, that one day we will die, and that sort of marks a sort of end to our life and our projects, and everything we do is in the light of that end, in the light of that possibility. So for Heidegger, that's one of the points that he stresses. But this idea of authenticity, so living in a sort of freely chosen way, clearly made its way into the idea of humanism in the sort of humanist rebellion against sort of behaviorism and its sort of narrow focus on behavior and conditioning and how to sort of control behavior, and the sort of Freudian focus on these particular pathologies that affected people in industrial society. So the humanists were looking for something new, something different, and something that focused on a different sort of idea of humans, a more sort of positive idea of human beings and their capacities. Now I want to focus on Abraham Maslow in this video. I know the essay Hergenhahn talks about a number of other thinkers, Rollo May and Carl Rogers and so on. There's a lot of nice detail there, but I think we can see the essence of it from Maslow's view, and Maslow's sort of humanism and how it developed. Interestingly, Maslow, who grew up in Brooklyn, had a troubled relationship with his mother, famously saying later that he grew up without mother love. And talking about that as a kind of motivation for this sort of positive view of human beings that he developed, having sort of seen the opposite in his own mother. He went to City College and transferred to Cornell, later worked at the University of Wisconsin. He said his belief in behaviorism, B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, was totally eradicated when he and his wife had a baby. That sort of, I guess he means that seeing the sort of potential of a child and what it means and what it brings, just the sort of wonder, the sort of mystique, the sort of the uncertainty, all of that kind of takes it needs something more to explain it than a behaviorist approach, which is narrowly focused on sort of incentives and disincentives to behavior. So Maslow developed this sort of hierarchy that we see here on the left, the hierarchy of needs, and we see, so basically the sort of higher needs only emerge when the lower needs are taken care of and secured. So it kind of makes sense that you'd say that self-actualization is something that only emerges in an affluent society. And of course, that was the society that started to emerge in the post-war United States, and perhaps some other societies as well, where people had sort of taken care of their physiological needs, their basic physical needs, their needs for safety, perhaps their needs for love and belonging, and a certain amount of esteem. And so once those other needs are sort of taken care of one after the other, then you can begin to think about self-actualization. And Maslow understood this to be reaching one's full potential. That's what self-actualization means. So there's a sort of potential in humans that only really comes out or appears when our other basic needs have been taken care of. So when society is sort of affluent and sophisticated enough to have sort of to have taken care of the other needs, to have given individuals the safety, the love, and sort of opportunities for esteem, opportunities to be respected by others, opportunities for achievement, that sort of makes possible self-actualization. So Maslow's view is that the higher in the hierarchy they are, the more the needs are distinctively human and not shared with animals. So self-actualization, esteem, love and belonging have elements in them in the way sort of they're sort of expressed by humans that doesn't have a counterpart in other species. Perhaps we can say other species, they certainly have physiological needs and needs of safety, although perhaps there's a certain sophistication in the sort of human dimension of those when we think about human needs of safety and so on. But it's the way that the sort of higher up you go, we have less in common with animals in that respect. It's a distinctive approach to human beings. So one not like behaviorism or one using the methods of the physical sciences that's actually needed to explore something like self-actualization. So for Maslow, this is why the methods of the physical sciences are not relevant to the study of human beings, that they can't capture these sort of higher levels that have sort of no counterpart in the animal world, in sort of behavior outside human societies. So Maslow talks about the characteristics of self-actualizing people. They perceive reality accurately and fully. They demonstrate a great acceptance of themselves and others, sort of accepting the way they are. They exhibit spontaneity and naturalness, need for privacy, independent of their environment and culture. So their sort of thought, their ideals, their sort of beliefs, their dreams, whatever, are not sort of tied down by where they happen to grow up or where they the sort of characteristics of their own culture. A continuous freshness of appreciation, the ability to sort of, I guess, go outside and see wonder in the universe, to appreciate the sunset, that kind of thing. Periodic mystical peak experiences, that's an interesting one. Sort of intense peak experiences where you feel that you're sort of living at your peak. Those are key to self-actualization, experiences that sort of self-actualizing people have. Maslow also says they're concerned with all humans rather than, say, just a few. They tend to only have a few friends. They have a strong and independent ethical sense. So their ethical sense is not just derived from their society, it's independent of what other people in their society think. They have a well-developed and non-hostile sense of humor, so it's not targeted towards specific groups or sort of targeted to demean certain outgroups, but it's non-hostile, and they're creative. So the emphasis here, as you can see, is on the ideal human type. And Maslow and the other humanists felt that psychology had long focused on pathology and psychologically disturbed individuals, as well as the study of lower animals and behaviorism and other trends. So Maslow modeled this idea of self-actualizing people on actual people like Albert Einstein, Abraham Lincoln, Jane Addams, people who were thought to have reached heights of human self-actualization. But Maslow was clear and also pointed out that these individuals also have faults. It's not that they're perfect, right? They can be stubborn, they can be irritating, they can have a superficial vanity, an overblown sense of pride. So they're sort of they're susceptible to some of the same faults as the rest of us. So they're not sort of perfect, and in fact their faults can be magnified by some of their sort of extremist tendencies, their sort of intensity, and so on. So Maslow claims it's hard to reach the higher levels of the hierarchy, and so self-actualizing people are rare. And of course, the lower needs have a longer evolutionary history. It's only when you get to higher levels of affluence that you can really focus on the kind of higher needs, the sort of esteem needs and the sort of self-actualization needs. But the sort of lower needs have been with us for a longer time, and they're we're sort of well set in our psychology as things that motivate us. Now, Maslow distinguishes between what he calls deficiency motivation and being motivation. In deficiency motivation, the individual is seeking specific things to satisfy specific needs. So this sounds like the lower levels of the hierarchy. So perception is directed towards objects that satisfy particular needs. It's very different in being motivation, where individuals embrace the higher self-actualization related values of beauty, truth, and justice. And perception is open to a wider range of experience. So instead of just seeing things in terms of how they relate to particular needs, say a need for security, a need for food, a need for sort of shelter, individuals, once those needs are taken care of, individuals can begin to focus on the experience of beauty, the experience of truth, or to sort of worry about justice, the sort of relations among people in society. And they become open to a wider range of experience. For example, the appreciation of the environment as an aesthetic object, which sort of, in our society, that really becomes a thing in the 1970s, again, with sort of affluence. And we begin to worry and become concerned about the environment as a kind of aesthetic thing, but also as a kind of living framework for human life. It can also be an appreciation of art, of music, of theatre, of those kind of things which become important when the sort of lower needs are taken care of. So these are the things that feature in being motivation, when we sort of open to these higher values. And of course, humanist psychology sees people as essentially good. As long as they are placed in a healthy environment, they will thrive. So it's all about the kind of environment in which they're placed. This idea of human goodness goes back to philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, who argued that before the formation of society, humans were naturally sort of gregarious and happy, that they had a sort of natural tendency to look after themselves. They had a natural sympathy and pity for other people. And so for Rousseau, it was society that sort of formed people into the kind of selfish, acquisitive people that they sort of tended to become in early modern society. For Rousseau, it was the sort of society preceding the experience of the natural world before society that sort of allowed humans to sort of express their essential goodness. Okay, so before moving on to Fromm, let's look at some criticisms of humanistic psychology. And these are all kind of similar, as we'll see. It's often said the vocabulary of humanist psychology is not very scientific, not supported by the facts established by scientific psychology. And it seems often closer to philosophy or religion than psychology because of its focus on intuition and subjective meaning. So there's something, both of these ideas, there's something non-scientific about humanistic psychology. It's not it doesn't really have a sort of scientific method. And it's focused on these sort of subjective things like intuition, which are hard to measure. So, is it really the thrust of these objections is it really a science, or is it a kind of philosophy or even a religion? And many of the terms of humanistic psychology are nebulous or unclear and defy clear and easy definition. So how do we measure and test for authenticity, for example? So as we can see, these are all similar objections. Humanist psychologists might respond that these terms like authenticity, are appropriate for capturing something like the good or authentic human life, Using more scientific terms might make it impossible to express the ideas at stake. Humanists might say they're looking for a vocabulary to express the higher attributes and qualities of human life, and you can't sort of give them an easy scientific form because they're not. There are sort of these distinctively human capacities, and not sort of shared with other species, and not sort of definable in the same way. Okay, so now let's move on to look at Erich Fromm, and the passage from the Sane Society that we're looking at this week, which is titled Mental Health and Society. The Sane Society was published in 1955, and Fromm was quite famous at this time. He was on TV shows in the United States. His books were bestsellers, and they were sort of talked about in the press. So he was a kind of public figure. He was actually born in Frankfurt, in Germany in 1900, born to Orthodox Jewish parents. His father was a rabbi. He fled to the United States in the 1930s when the Nazis took power, and began to sort of associate with a lot of the new generation of the sort of post-Freudian generation of psychologists in the United States, people like Karen Horney and William Sullivan, and sort of made the United States, the East Coast, his home during that period, and he lived there until his death in 1980. He actually moved to Mexico late in his life, actually before he died, and did some interesting studies in Mexico, some interesting psychological studies as well. So one of Fromm's early works was called Escape from Freedom, sometimes translated as Fear of Freedom as well. And in this work, he argues that freedom from the traditional bonds of medieval society, though giving the individual a new feeling of independence, at the same time made him feel alone and isolated, and filled him with doubt and anxiety, and drove him into a new submission and into a compulsive and irrational activity. So what Fromm's describing here is a kind of social change, the change from the kind of fixed bonds of medieval society where you're defined by your relation to the patron or your relation to the Lord, and you sort of have a fixed identity through time, through the course of your life that doesn't change. So when those sort of bonds are freed and we enter in this new world of market or capitalist society, there's this new freedom. Individuals can choose for themselves, can sort of have to decide what they're going to do in terms of work and how they're going to provide for themselves. And although this gave the individual this new sort of sense of independence, but at the same time it created this sort of feeling of aloneness and this new doubt and anxiety. And those are the things that Fromm sees as leading eventually to the phenomenon of fascism in the 20th century as a way of sort of solving those doubts and anxieties, or sort of resolving them with a kind of strong and powerful authoritarian state. So this is an early example of how Fromm sees society and mental health as connected. And it's in this book that he produced the first reading anywhere of the phenomenon of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is the willing submission to authority through which people cope with anxiety and isolation of the freedom from traditional bonds, according to Fromm. So it's a direct result of social changes that leave us with this need to define ourselves, that leave us without these sort of fixed bonds. And sometimes the sort of anxiety and that causes and the isolation is too much for individuals to bear. So they look for new forms of submission to authority, and new ways of sort of submitting themselves to different authorities that are going to sort of take away their anxiety. So this is an early sort of example of that connection between mental health and society. So So this is a nice statement of Fromm's basic humanism, or his commitment to humanism, on page 68 of the reading. Fromm says mental health is characterized by the ability to love and to create, by the emergence from incestuous ties to clan and soil, by a sense of identity based on one's experience of self as the subject and agent of one's powers, by the grasp of reality inside and outside ourselves, that is, by the development of objectivity and reason. So there's a process here where we sort of break free of, Fromm calls these incestuous ties to clan and soil, right? Where we sort of define by the tribe we belong to, we define by the clan we belong to, we're defined by where we come from, the sort of community where we're born. So gradually over time, these sort of ties become less important. And it's one's identity based on one's experience of oneself that begins to be more important in modern society, as individuals have to sort of decide for themselves. And to be healthy, Fromm says they have to develop their capacity to love and to do creative work, to do creative things. Those are the things that are going to tie them to other people and also allow them to sort of realize themselves and realize their capacities. Fromm mentions the work of what he calls the great spiritual teachers. He means people like Confucius, Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, Moses, Lao Tzu. That this idea comes from these great spiritual teachers. So this mirrors the idea of a striving for self-actualization, experiencing ourselves and our powers, developing our capacities. And he sees all these traits in the sort of great spiritual traditions. Now, like other humanists, and this is something that was a sort of a strong emphasis for the humanists, something for which they're sometimes criticized as sort of not putting enough emphasis on the group. But they certainly put a lot of emphasis on the individual, on leaving behind group ties which were previously central to identity. So relation to mother or family or clan or tribe, ethnic group, or even a social authority like religion or nation. For Fromm, we have to sort of leave those things behind. We have to grow as individuals beyond those group identities in order to realize ourselves. And in fact, Fromm says on page 68, all forms of identity experience based on the group leave man dependent, hence weak. So there's a very negative view of the role of sort of group ties as sort of keeping people stuck in certain patterns that don't allow them to develop and realize themselves as individuals. So this is the key claim of Fromm's essay, of Fromm's passage on mental health and society. Whether or not the individual is healthy, Fromm says, is primarily not an individual matter, but depends on the structure of his society. So it's the role of society, the role played by society in determining whether an individual is healthy or not. And the key point here is that for Fromm, a healthy society develops the capacity for creative, productive work and for love, the way of sort of uniting with people through forms of love, sort of creative, productive work, and also to develop their sort of reason and objectivity, to take an objective view of society that's not just a sort of projection of the interests of their own tribe or the interests of their own clan. So there are clear social conditions of mental health, according to Fromm. A society which creates hostility rather than love, or a society where work deprives people of a developed sense of self, will construct and form individuals with poor mental health, right? So it depends on the sort of framework of society and the possibilities for developing our capacities of love, creativity, and reason that is going to determine whether individuals are healthy or not. And Fromm distinguishes this view from two other psychological perspectives. He distinguishes it from what he calls the adjustment view. And this view, which was very prevalent in the 1950s when Fromm is writing, which describes mental health as the successful adjustment to the demands of social institutions. So the idea is that individuals are healthy to the extent that they are able to comply with the demands of institutions like factories, schools, hospitals, etc. It's their adjustment to those institutions that determines health. The other perspective he disagrees with is the Freudian view, which talks about a basic contradiction, a basic conflict between human nature and society. Fromm doesn't believe that that's true, that there's a necessary conflict. There may be a conflict, of course, in particular cases between what society demands and what human nature needs, but there's no conflict in itself between human nature and society. You can have societies where human nature is healthy. You can also have societies where human nature is made unhealthy. So, as Fromm argues, the adjustment view, which simply talks about health in terms of adjustment to social institutions, adjustment can be pathological if social institutions are not arranged in a healthy way. So if work is more about exploitation than creativity and self-expression, individuals who work in those institutions, be factories, offices, etc., are not going to be mentally healthy to the extent that they're not able to engage in creative and productive work. So it depends on the kind of capacities which those institutions promote, right? So it's healthy if those institutions are healthy and promoting sort of healthy capacities, but adjustment is not healthy if social institutions are in fact promoting unhealthy ideas and making individuals sick through the sort of promoting values like exploitation or dependence or other things. Now, as for the Freudian view, Freud assumes this necessary and, as he believes, a tragic conflict between the requirements of civilization, in other words, what society requires of individuals, and mental health. That for Freud, what individuals need in terms of their mental health can never be fully provided by society, that there will always be that conflict there. Now, Fromm argues that Freud only adopts this position because he is convinced that the characteristics of the society he lived in are essential features of any society. So Freud lived in a very capitalist and a very patriarchal society. And of course, one of the things we've touched on before is that that sort of patriarchal characteristics may have been part of the reason why a lot of people, women especially, were becoming sick in the society in which Freud lived. But because Freud views those characteristics as necessary, right, so any society would have to be patriarchal, capitalist, etc., Freud assumes that there's going to be this necessary conflict between human nature and society. So the conflict is seen as necessary rather than being a result of the way that society was structured at the time he was writing, structured to be capitalist and patriarchal, and those things are not necessary, right? We can construct a society that doesn't have those features, and in doing so, we would get rid of the conflict between human nature and society that Freud said was essential. A really important concept for Fromm is this idea of social character. And what he means by social character are the personality characteristics of the individual as they're formed by the social conditions in which they live. So the idea is that each society is going to form and shape individuals so that they derive satisfaction from spending their energies in socially desirable ways. This is a little bit like Foucault's argument Foucault's idea that we saw, that society kind of disciplines individuals and makes them into the kind of persons that are going to be useful. Fromm is a little bit, being a psychologist, is a bit more focused on their sort of psychic energies. So it's the fact that they derive psychic pleasure from engaging in these socially desirable ways. So individuals are made to want to do, as Fromm sometimes says, what is socially necessary for them to do. So that's the function performed by social character. It's the sort of the way the individual is formed to live in those social conditions and to derive satisfaction from spending their energies in ways that are socially desirable. An example here is industrial society of, say, the 19th century. This society required a person whose energy would be spent working with the virtues of discipline, orderliness, and punctuality. That necessity had to be transformed into an inner drive of individuals, so they have to want to do that, or they have to sort of have some drive that sort of that brings them to do that they can express this discipline and orderliness throughout the day. They're not sort of in conflict with other people. They're sort of doing their own task in a disciplined way. So it's transformed into a kind of inner drive so that they do willingly what was socially necessary. That's the sort of key thing that society does. So although society is able to mold and shape individuals, Fromm says that the individual is not a blank sheet of paper. So it's not like there's sort of, there's nothing written and society can just sort of mold individuals as it pleases. The need for happiness, harmony, love, and freedom are inherent in human nature for Fromm, and in fact they help drive social change in history. So it's this dynamic conflict between what society demands of individuals and these sort of underlying human needs for things like happiness, harmony, love, and freedom that drives the social process, right? And as Fromm sees it, and he sees sort of movements of sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, like feminism, and then the civil rights movement in the 1960s, as sort of bringing these ideas, bringing this sort of conflict to the surface almost, that they're sort of pushing towards these sort of more open ideas of happiness and love and freedom for everybody. And sort of taking aim at the restrictions in society that sort of that deny those possibilities for some people, or maybe for all people in some respects. So they're sort of driving society towards progress, making progress towards being a society that is more able to satisfy individuals' innate needs, and that's essentially how Fromm views the historical process, through this kind of dynamic conflict. Okay, so let's have a look at the tasks for this week. Hopefully you've done the reading by Hergen, Hahn, and Fromm before looking at this video, but there's you'll see the two readings in this week's module. So there are two readings to get through. There's a quiz 4, which is on the readings by Hergen, Hahn, and Fromm, and on this video. The markup assignment this week is a selection from Erich Fromm's text, and we're going to look at a selection that focuses on mental health and society. In the voice thread assignment, the voice thread task this week, we're going to follow up on that by thinking about the relation between society and mental health. And in the discussion post, we'll focus on psychology, understanding psychology in its social context, as we've talked about here, and trying to sort of see if that sort of carries over to other philosophies, other sort of psychological ideas and philosophies and other sort of psychological concepts, whether we can sort of see that relation at work and how we can sort of relate them in a kind of social historical context. So So yeah, those are the things we're going to focus on this week.